On behalf of BIA and the China British Business Council and BioCentury, I wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar today, which is called Update on Opportunities in China, Policy and Regulatory Changes. My name is Josh Berlin. I lead Business Development and China-Asia Strategy at BioCentury. BioCentury is honored to serve as a partner on this webinar, which continues a long tradition of BIA and BioCentury working together on China biotech related projects. Next slide, please. I did want to take 1 minute to let you know about the 8th BioCentury Bay Helix China Healthcare Summit. That event is scheduled for November 16 to 19 as both a digital and in-person event. This year's theme is the rise of China biotechs and the potential impact on the global biopharma ecosystem. I think it's a great opportunity to hear the latest on China biotech, including an exclusive conference report from our partners McKinsey & Company, and the event will also showcase about 60 China, Asia, and Western biotechs who will be presenting digitally, and you can meet them in person using our one-to-one meeting system, either in person or digitally. We are honored that BIA is a supporting organization again for the China Summit, so please note that BIA members are eligible for a special discount to attend this event. You can visit our website at biocenturychinasummit.com for more information or email our help desk to get the code to register with the BIA discount. So with that brief pitch, I did want to transition now to talk about today's webinar. We are fortunate to have 3 great speakers on the program today. They will help us learn about China policy and regulatory changes, which may impact China's strategies for UK and European biotechs. We will start with a presentation from Hamish King, Chief Operating Officer of CISEMA, which is a China-focused CRO and regulatory consultancy. Hamish is based in Hong Kong and will discuss the China approval process for innovative therapies. He will highlight recent developments that could help UK and European biotechs accelerate R&D and product approvals in China. Next, we will hear from Catherine Wang, a partner with Ropes & Gray in Shanghai. Catherine will discuss China legal developments, which could have a big impact on UK and European biotechs operating in China. This includes a new data privacy law and protection of personal and biosecurity information. And finally, we will hear from Shun Yang, Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of BioOrbit Ltd, which is a UK headquartered company that manufactures and supplies bioreagents to life sciences companies, universities, and researchers, including customers in China. Shen will discuss the impact China regulatory changes have had on life sciences logistics and laboratory management, including the importing of reagent and supplies into China. After that, we will have a Q&A session with all 3 of our speakers. So please feel free to ask a question at any time. You can use the questions tab on your webinar screen, which you should be able to see right there on your screen. And I will look at everyone's questions and save them to the end, and I'll ask them on your behalf during our Q&A session at the end. So with that brief introduction, I think we should get started now. I will now hand the program over to Hamish, and he will discuss updates to the China approval process for innovative therapies. Hamish?
Thanks, Josh. Hello, and thank you to BIA, BioCentury, and China Britain Business Council for having me for the program today. As Josh mentioned, I'm going to set the scene a little bit by focusing on the regulatory and policy changes before Catherine goes into a lot more detail around the legal specific points. And Shin is going to follow with some commercial perspective. Next slide, please. So just briefly about myself, I'm a lawyer by training, qualified in Sydney, Australia, and in Hong Kong, and I work at CISEMA, which is a CRO and regulatory affairs consultancy, 100% China focused. And we're founded in Germany and in Beijing in 2002. So the NMPA, as shown here on the slide, is the key regulator. You will probably be aware for China pharmaceutical products, as well as medical devices, IVDs, and cosmetics. It's been restructured a number of times, and that is the key constant when you get to China regulation of life sciences products. It is changing frequently, regularly, as it increasingly matures, and that's going to be a theme I'm going to hammer away on as we move through. Next slide, please, Sam. The key bodies within the NMPA that you should be aware of are the CDE, the Center for Drug Evaluation, the Chinese Pharmacopoeia, and the NIFDC and CFDI. I've just listed them out here. There's a lot of acronyms there. This, of course, isn't the entire regulatory framework for drug approvals in China. Catherine's going to talk a bit more about, for example, the Ministry of Science and Technology, or MOST, for human genetics resources, because these are increasingly focused in terms of China applications and approvals. But there's a broad and sometimes overlapping regulatory framework, which can sometimes be tricky to navigate, but it is increasing and maturing over time. Next slide, please. So there are three categories of drug approvals in China: chemical medicines, biological products, and traditional Chinese medicines. Chemical medicines, chemical drugs are further subdivided into 5 broad classes. There's the new drugs, so class 1 product, innovative. The regulation requirements are extremely strict, and clinical trial phases are very demanding and long. Then there's class 2, new improved drugs. For generics, class 3 and 4, these are really applicable to Chinese manufacturers only. And it's class 5 of chemical medicines that's most relevant to UK biotech companies, because this is for imported drugs. Both class 5 as well as class 2 drugs have a subdivision, and in particular there is a similar to the FDA's 505(b)(2) type, where a modification of an improved API or drug, as well as a generic type for the imported products. For biologic products, these are further subdivided into what we call preventative biological products and therapeutic biologic products, as well as IVD reagents managed by biologic products. And this can also be increasingly relevant as combination products, increasingly popular. Next slide. Just before we move on, the types of NMPA approvals have broad categories which are relatively straightforward. The new registration, which is valid for 5 years, a renewal, which should be submitted 6 months before expiration, and your change certificate. Thank you. Next slide. So there's a bit of detail here, and I won't go into much of it because we're pressed for time. But the broad point to be aware of is that the process can be long and demanding, even though it is being shortened, and there are continued attempts to shorten it further. For example, clinical trial applications are made to the CDEs, the Center for Drug Evaluation, and formally that process or that approval could take 6 to 8 months or more. But now there's a default approval unless the CDE objects within 60 days. One thing to be aware of is that foreign applicants must designate the legal person within China to handle your local relevant, your local drug registration matters, and also for human genetic resources, only a Chinese entity can apply for and hold the relevant license. As always, early dialogue with the regulator is emphasized and increasingly required for certain categories. And in terms of general idea of cost or fees, new drugs from or made outside of China pay around a £30,000 fee, 376,000 renminbi for the clinical trial application, and there's a further application fee of around £50,000. Generic drugs made outside of China pay an application fee of around £45,000. Next slide, please. So there has been increasing maturity of the Chinese drug regulatory system, and it is increasingly moving toward an international harmonization, as well as being part of ICH. One good example is that applications are now submitted in Common Technical Document, CTD form, with some minor variations. And a crude idea of the increasing maturity is also in just the staff size for the regulatory body. There are now 1,000 staff in the relevant drug management department, but you compare this to 1,200 staff who work in the UK's MHRA, and when you consider that China has 20 times the population of the UK, it gives you an idea of how there is more development to come. The fast-track approvals have also been emphasised, although companies outside of China generally struggle to be approved for these. One relatively recent example is Biogen's Spinraza. It treats rare disease of spinal muscular atrophy, and it was granted priority review and approval a couple of years ago, meaning that it had its China approval around 790 days after its US FDA approval, and the China review and approval took only 170 days because NMPA accepted its overseas clinical trial data. Next slide, please. And the theme around speeding up the approval process is also just summarized from a high level here on the slide. It can be relatively simple steps like port inspections, which need no longer be mandatory. I mentioned the clinical trial approvals, which are by default approved unless CDE objects. And there's overseas clinical trial acceptance, or rather acceptance of your trial data, which can be quite a significant step and save you a lot of time rather than doing a local China clinical trial in addition. And there are frameworks developing for accommodating multi-regional clinical trials, which speeds your global regulatory strategy. There's the general exhortation for global, or rather your global simultaneous clinical development strategies to start your conversations early with the regulator. And for legacy products, examine your available data, check how relevant it is to Chinese patients, and ask the CDE, the regulator itself, for advice on the next step. Maybe you need to do a bridging study, or for an IND, consider your China development strategy early and leverage your pre-IND meetings and milestone meetings to obtain advice about next steps. Of course, a quick plug for BioCentury and CBDC, who can help with some of the commercialization aspects, which I won't touch on here, like market research, partner identification, etc. Next slide. And just briefly on out-licensing and outsourcing, this is not possible at this stage for UK biotech companies. Your production needs to be in China. There are some interesting statements being made, however, by party or government members, officials, regarding potential cross-border commissioning production mechanisms, which we piloted in Shanghai. And a quick note, of course, that China is more strict generally when it comes to, with regards to some more difficult substances like narcotics, psychotropic drugs, toxic drugs. These are generally forbidden. Next slide and final slide. I just want to touch on is one alternative pathway to also be aware of is Hong Kong registration or listing, because this is a relatively new policy development allowing Hong Kong drugs that are sold into Hong Kong to then also be sold into China's Greater Bay Area, which has a population greater than that of the UK. The Hong Kong listing process is a much simpler, cheaper, quicker process than China's NMPA process. And if your product is sold into a Hong Kong hospital, you can then apply to the Guangdong MPA, the local MPA as well. That is, you've been accepted by a Hong Kong-owned hospital within the Greater Bay Area to sell into the GBA. So far in the pilot program, 9 drugs and 2 medical devices have been approved and are now being sold in the GBA, despite having no China NMPA approvals. So this is a space to watch as the pilot program develops, and there has been quite a lot of momentum about this recently. So that's all from me. I better stop and pass it over to Catherine, who's going to go into a lot more detail around some of the thorny points of your China approvals.
Great. And Catherine, before you started, Hamish, thank you so much for the presentation. And I did just want to remind everyone that we will take a few of your questions at the end of today's webinar. So you can feel free to submit your questions at any time via the questions tab in your webinar box. So next up, we'll hear from Catherine Wong of Ropes and Gray, and she'll provide a legal update for us for UK and European biotechs operating in China. So Catherine, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. I should say good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending the webinar today. I'm a regulatory lawyer, and I've been practicing in China for close to 20 years. So I think it's a great opportunity for me to be here and actually give you an update of the recent changes in the data protection regulatory framework. And that may have some fundamental implications for biopharmaceutical companies. So let me start with the agenda of today, if we can flip the page. So yeah, this is actually a brief introduction to my background. And for today's purpose, actually, I'm going to focus on two main topics. One is to give everyone an introduction to the evolving data legal regime. And then we're going to discuss what it means for life sciences companies which would like to enter into China. So if we move to the next one, please.
Are you able to see it, Catherine? There might be a brief delay.
No, actually, I haven't seen the pages changed. There may be a slow connection from China, so I don't know if that was the cause.
Yeah, the slide
Can
I'm
you
seeing
all
is,
see the
slide I'm seeing is China's evolving data legal requirement with your timeline.
I'm happy to actually go through the page with the copy I have on the hand. So if everyone can see the slides from your computer, I'll just go through. Yes. So
Perfect.
the data regulatory regime in China actually should start with the issuance of the state secrets law. And the reason why I use that as the starting point to set the landmark is because broadly speaking, there are actually 4 recent new legislations that form the data privacy and cybersecurity legal framework. And they all center around the national security as China's key strategic priority. So the first one actually is the cybersecurity law, which was issued in 2017. And after that, the government in China has announced several administrative measures in draft form for public comments to implement the cybersecurity law. And the cybersecurity law actually covers some high-level principles of privacy protection.
Catherine, I think we're having trouble hearing you.
Catherine, I don't believe we can hear you. So I don't know if you've changed any settings on your end, but we can't hear you.
law that also center around national security, but also could have very lasting impact on the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. And then the most recent two laws that the government has announced are the data security law and the personal information protection law. The data security law talks about a concept which is to classify data by
Catherine, I think we're having some difficulty with your audio.
One is the personal information protection law, which actually is the privacy legislation in China. And we're going to talk a bit more about the impact of personal information protection law on biopharmaceutical companies, because essentially many of the companies will need to collect personal information from Chinese patients in order to conduct clinical trials, as well as to develop their products for regulatory filings. So if we can turn to the next slide. We discussed about the national security priorities, and that's the centerpiece or the theme of all these four pillars of the national security legal framework. And the Chinese government actually strongly emphasized the importance of its sovereignty over data and human genetic or biological materials. And there are several, I think, tools or legislative vehicles introduced by these regulations or laws that give you a sense of where the Chinese government is heading to in terms of overseeing all the collection, processing, and cross-border transfer of data and bioresources. So here on this slide and on the following slide, I'm going to take you through a few control vehicles that I think are common themes in China's cybersecurity and bio protection and data protection framework. So the first one is foreign restriction. So just to give everyone an example, it is clearly stated in the Human Genetic Resources Regulation that foreign entities are prohibited from collecting and preserving the human genetic resources in China. And let's actually clarify a little bit about the scope of human genetic resources, because it's actually broader than the name suggested. It's not limited to any materials or data that carry genetic characteristics. It also includes essentially all the biological materials, as well as data derived from the human tissues or cells or organs. So theoretically speaking, for example, if you are running a clinical trial in China and you are collecting PK/PD data, you probably will collect human genetic resources. And if you are a foreign entity, which basically includes a company that has foreign shareholders or is contractually controlled by a foreign party, those entities will need to collaborate with Chinese entities. And in most cases, they are Chinese hospitals in order to run the trials or conduct international collaborations. The second theme is data localization. So clearly in several regulations, the Chinese government declared that the patient demographic data, health data, and medical data, they must be stored onshore. So for all the cross-border transfer, essentially the Chinese government will expect to conduct security review if the data quantity is considered significant. So for example, the most recent draft measure on security review suggested that if you're collecting personal information above 1 million people, or if you're collecting sensitive personal information above 100,000 people, you will probably be subject to a security review by the Chinese Cybersecurity Administration. So if we turn to the next slide. In addition to the three control vehicles we just discussed, there are three other control vehicles. So the next one is export control. And technical information, for example, could be subject to export control by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. And it's unclear whether any of the health data or medical data and the information about the therapeutics or diagnostics could be subject to export control eventually. But this is an area where China gives itself some space or some leeway to define the applicability depending on the actual situation or the country's national security needs. The next one is entity list. So actually, similar to the US, in China, in these laws and regulations, Chinese government actually wanted to be able to adopt a counter-discrimination measure when the foreign country or foreign governments introduce some ban or restriction on the outbound export or transfer activities of important technology. And also in several legislations, the government made it clear that if foreign entities or offshore organizations are found in violation of those national security regulations, they may be subject to a blacklist, which will prevent them from receiving personal information or health data or medical data from China. And it's interesting that the new regulations, the 4 pillars, they all have some level of extraterritorial application. Just to take personal information protection law as an example, the Chinese government actually took reference from GDPR. So if you are a company and you're offering pharmaceutical products to Chinese patients, you're likely going to be subject to the China's personal information protection law. And it's unclear how the government is trying to enforce the regulations extraterritorially. So far, we've seen some precedents in relation to antitrust enforcement, and the government potentially could issue penalty notices to collect administrative fines from foreign organizations. But whether this will be universally adopted in all areas remains unclear. So let's turn to the next slide. We're going to actually explore what the new laws and regulations mean for life sciences companies operating in China. So if we turn to the next slide, I think there are several threshold questions that companies should clarify and think of when they decide on their compliance system and process. So the first question is, in China, what kind of data and what's the quantity of data you're trying to process? The action of processing actually is similar to what GDPR defines. It's very broad. It includes collection, use, deletion, and transfer, for example. And in most cases, if you are running clinical trials in China, you're definitely collecting patients' information. And you may also potentially collect healthcare professionals' information if you are doing physician detailing. So there are many cases where you're going to process personal information. And China also actually categorizes certain personal information as sensitive personal information. All the medical and health information is defined as sensitive personal information. And the regulatory control for sensitive personal information is going to be more stringent. The next category of data, as we just discussed, is the human genetic resources data. And as I said, it includes basically data derived from human organs, tissues, cells, or any materials that carry genetic characteristics or Chinese genome information. There's another category of important data, and this is actually a concept that is not really well defined in the cybersecurity law or the data security law. It is expected that different government agencies in charge of different industry sectors will define what important data means in their respective responsible industry sectors. So based on some of the draft guidance and measures published by the government, it seems that the Chinese hospitals will be able to consider as critical information infrastructure operators, and the medical records retained by the hospitals will probably be considered as important data. So this is actually some examples of when you determine what type and quantity of data you're going to process, you probably should consider which category of definition the data will be attributed to. The second category of questions you can consider is the legal basis for processing. So like GDPR, Chinese personal information protection law and the biosecurity law and cybersecurity law essentially relies on informed consent. But for sensitive personal information, it's actually going to be a separate consent, which again remains a vague idea as of now, because whether you can define a consent as separate could basically be determined based on the overall structure of your consent letter or statement. It could also be founded in the contract that you're going to enter into with a Chinese counterparty. So to what degree that consent could be determined and meets the definition of a separate consent is going to be further interpreted in the implementing regulations. If you don't have the informed consent, in certain situations, you may be able to rely on the need to fulfill certain statutory duties in order to process personal information. So that is, again, an interesting topic, because the personal information protection law doesn't really define what statutory duties would mean in each of the situations. And we're trying to actually ascertain if, for example, as the pharmaceutical company, you're running clinical trials, you may have statutory duties under China's GCP. So that may give you the basis of processing patients' information in the event that they withdrew from the studies. And cross-border transfer of data actually is going to be very important, and we're having several slides in the following, I would say, discussion to actually share with you more information about cross-border transfer. So let's first move on to the next slide. Here I'm trying to give you an example or illustration of the overlapping regulatory controls, because we were talking about different laws and regulations, and they have different legislative focuses. So just to give you an example, essentially for life sciences companies, we at least are talking about the personal information protection law, biosecurity law, and the data security law. So there could be data that would be subject to all three legislations, like genetic data or Chinese human genome. There could also be situations where the data would be subject to personal information protection law and data security law. One example is the medical records retained by Chinese public hospitals. There could also be situations where the data is subject to personal information protection law and biosecurity law. An example is
Catherine, I think we're having trouble with your video. Oh, sorry, your audio again. Let me try to give it maybe 30 more seconds, in which case we'll transfer over to Shin.
To talk more about the second topic, which is related to processing of personal information. And we discussed in the previous session that the concept of processing is similar to GDPR. It includes a variety of activities, including collection, storage, use, processing, transmission, provision, disclosure, and deletion. There are several bases where you can rely on to process personal information. So we discussed about the consent. We also discussed about the performance of statutory duties. There is a catch-all provision, which is if you can refer to a special law or administrative regulation that allows you to process personal information, even if you don't have actually full compliance with what is required by personal information protection law. In reliance of that other law or regulation, you may be able to get the data out from China. It's interesting to note that there's no equivalent of legitimate interest in the China's personal information protection law as opposed to GDPR. So in most cases, we're trying to really enhance the sophistication of the informed consent, because that's probably going to be the safer basis for companies to collect and use personal information from Chinese patients. So if we turn to the next one, which there are actually two slides which talk about the next one, please. So we're talking about cross-border transfer. And I wanted to actually highlight some important requirements under China's personal information protection law. So if you would like to share data from Chinese data subjects, usually the patients, with a foreign recipient or a offshore personal information processor, you need to give the data subject advance notice, and the notice will need to include several items of information. You need to disclose the identity of the foreign recipient, the method of contacting the recipient, the purposes of methods of processing, and the type of personal information involved. And the last one is how the individual data subject can exercise his or her rights against the recipient. And this recipient, broadly speaking, covers potential licensors, for example, in a cross-border licensing transaction. It could also cover all the potential third-party vendors like a central lab or a CRO or even foreign regulatory authorities. So if you were not able to fully list or extensively list all the recipients in your informed consent, then we need to discuss and explore what would be the better way of trying to satisfy Chinese statutory requirements and minimize your compliance risk exposure. And as we discussed, in this case, if you're sharing personal information with an offshore recipient, you need to get a separate consent from the data subjects in China. So let's turn to the next slide. When we discuss about the legal basis of personal information processing, we discussed the concept of consent. But actually, when you talk about cross-border transfer, there is sometimes an additional layer of regulatory oversight. So currently, under China's personal information protection law, when you transfer the personal information outside China, you will need to fulfill one of the following 4 conditions. And apparently, some of the conditions were unable to be met because the process and prerequisites haven't been fully defined and published by the government. So we discussed about the security assessment. So that's definitely one possibility, but the Chinese cybersecurity regulator hasn't really issued the process of getting the security assessment filed and accepted. And the second topic is, second option actually is, if you cannot or don't want to go through the security assessment pathway, the recipient should obtain a personal information protection certification from a Chinese government designated professional institution. And the third possibility is you need to enter into a contract with the data recipient, including all the standard contract clauses prescribed by the Chinese cybersecurity regulator. And as of today, we haven't seen any draft form of the standard clauses. So it's also basically unlikely for companies to comply. And the last one, I think, is probably the most important basis for companies to legally transfer personal information from China. This actually also links back to human genetic resources regulation and the biosecurity law, which we're going to discuss in the following slide. So let's turn to the next slide, please. So we discussed about the basis of getting data outside of China, and we have when we have gone through all the conditions, and not every condition is able to be met. So at least for pharmaceutical companies, I think it's probably easiest to refer to the human genetic resources regulation when you try to process and also share the patient personal information, at least within the scope of human genetic resources data, with compliance of the human genetic resources regulation. So in most cases, the clinical study data will largely fall under the definition of human genetic resources data. And to get the data outside of China, there are 2 possible pathways. One is you basically get an advance approval from the Human Genetic Resources Administration of China prior to the processing, if you are a sponsor, a CRO, or a central lab. And if you don't belong to any of the 3 main categories, you will have to work with the Chinese site to fulfill the notification requirement. And the notification will have to be filed before the data is shared with a foreign recipient or an offshore recipient. So once you were able to get the approval or notification completed, you will acquire the legal basis of transferring the data and also for the foreign recipient to process the data. And let's move to the next slide, which I think
Hey, Catherine, I think we're starting to run a little bit long, so if you don't mind, maybe we'll transition to Shun. I mean, this is a really a lot to unpack here, and I think this is a lot of food for thought for folks, given how much is changing, how quickly. So we could talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A session, but I did want to make sure we also left time for a few questions at the end. So again, if you have questions, you can use the questions box on your screen. And I'll now turn it over to Shun Yang, who will talk a little bit about logistics and the impact regulations have had on in particular on importing reagents and other life sciences products into China.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the sharing of Catherine. I learned quite a lot by hearing the previous two speakers. So I am the co-founder of BioOrbit, and we the next slides. Just a bit of background about BioOrbit. We are the large catalog manufacturer and distributor sellers of life science reagents for the researchers at the universities and research institutions. So we have research use and only antibodies, proteins, ELISA kits, and biomolecules. We set up a lab in Cambridge and also a lab in Wuhan. So the lab in Wuhan has the ability to make and categorize antibodies and ELISA kits, etc. So it's quite a standardized lab type of work. So next slide, please. This is just a general information, the number of product service we provide. We have a primary antibody, secondary antibody protein, and we do provide the services as well. So next slide. So my main focus is the commercials of the aspects operating a business in China. I mean, we are not as the very big pharmaceutical companies. So for us, the whole process seems quite complicated. If you have ever tried to, done business in China, you know it has lots of red tapes. For example, when you register your company, you need to have this stamp, this red stamp. Probably some people know about that. And you need to go, have lots of stamps when you set up your bank account. And so it's quite complicated process. But there are lots of agents, lawyers out there to help you. So it's quite easy to overcome. And you probably aware more and more experienced, talented people you can hire. But you do need to be aware of the employment law, which is actually very different from the employment law in the UK. I mean, I'm not going into too much details into that. But one thing I noticed is the salary actually is not as cheap as you think, because you add the national insurance and the pension. There's also housing allowance, all that on top of that. Actually, it can be quite expensive. But in China, you do also have R&D tax credit to encourage more scientific discoveries. And one thing we noticed is the cross-border supply chain is not that mature and it can be very complicated. So let's go into the next slides. So logistic challenge into China. So obviously we have a biological products which we do sell into China, and each year we have to apply the new certificate to be enable that importing process. And so we spend lots of time to find out how to do this. So the governing body, obviously the state administration for entry and exit inspection and quarantine. And they have special articles on how you quarantine the products, what sorts of documents you need. And they also do randomized inspection of products when you importing into China. So that can be quite challenging if, say, if your product is quite a small quantity and they select your product for inspection and then destroy the product. So you need to be prepared. You have certain amount of quantity for to send to China, just in case that's get selected for inspection. Next slide, please. So we kind of summarized this general trade import declaration process. It's actually more complicated than that, but you do go through each steps. This they call the special item verification form you need to complete. You do the customer declaration. There is an electronic process you can do, and there's the inspection declaration you need to do. And then sometimes they come on site to do inspection, and also at the custom you can do on-site declaration. Obviously, the import duty, you need to have an account with the custom to do the import duty. And then as I mentioned, the random inspection, sometimes they may isolate your products, especially during the COVID time. So they almost isolate all the biological products entering into China. And so you do need to be aware that kind of time frame it can add to your process. Next slide, please. So, because we already have a lab in China, and just briefly talk about those regulations around that. There is a general requirement for biosafety issued by the General Administration of Quality Supervision, Inspection, and Quarantine of the People's Republic of China, and they also have the criteria for laboratory biosafety, and there's 4 levels. The BSL level 1 is the lowest, and the 4 is the highest. I'm not going into too much detail into that. You can check that out online. So there's kind of equivalent sort of lab requirement in China. So next slide, please. Just to sort of give you idea, there's also for animal testing. There's the regulation called the Laboratory Animals General Requirement for Animal Experiment, and I list out all these things. There's just all these associated articles for the animal management. I'm not going into detail, but it just give you a scope that you have to follow all those procedures and instructions to make sure you meet the requirement. Next slide, please. So I think the previous speakers already touched on this. There are those latest issues of Chinese law on medical products and vaccines. Actually, China now updated this quite frequently. Those are the 2019 revision. You can check it out. So this is issued by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. The next slide, please. So those are some of the Chinese regulatory bodies. As mentioned, the Standing Committee, that's the highest level. They issue all sorts of regulatory standards. And the ones applicable to the pharmaceutical biotech industries is State Food and Drug Administration. And in particularly the China Food and Drug Control Institute. They are the ones basically responsible for the implementation of standards for drugs, biological products, medical equipment. They also distribute those medical device reference materials, and they do the inspections annually. So that's one institute you need to follow their website closely. Next slide, please. So this is just one case study about molecular diagnostic assay. So without the registration process, you can't import that into China. And the regulatory law, the registration process is under the administration measure of the registration of in vitro diagnostic reagents. And I put the link there. You can find the latest version for that. Next slide, please. So just for that case, the China National Inspection Institute, they published the drug standard, and under the supervision of the State Drug Administration, they also have the national standard available there. So those are basically those standards you have to make sure you comply with. So any IVD manufacturers have to check out those and make sure you follow those process. Okay, the next slide, please. Oh, that's the end. It's quite brave. So basically for us is really to make sure we follow the local regulations and deal with the complexities. And one final notes in what I notice is there's a national level of laws, regulations, but often implemented in the province or the city level. So you're actually dealing, say, our offices in Wuhan, so you're dealing with the Hubei province or the city level. It can, it is sometimes from province to province, they can interpret the standard a bit differently. So you just need to make sure you follow the local guidance. That's for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Shun, and thank you for all of our speakers today. I thought this was a really interesting discussion with a lot to unpack here. You know, a lot of recent developments that I think are of critical importance to UK and European biotechs. We do have a few minutes for our Q&A session, and I do apologize for the audio difficulty we were having with Catherine. You know, that sometimes happens when we have a global event like this across many borders. We did get a few questions that have come in from everyone today, so I really appreciate it. I had a list of about 50 questions myself. I don't think we'll have time for all of that, but I did want to start with a few questions that have come in from our audience. And Hamish, maybe we'll start with you. This I thought was an interesting question that came in during your presentation from a member of the audience. And this is a question around testing in China and the requirements for testing as part of your CTA or NDA application that you'll need to make to to the China FDA. So can you talk a little bit about testing requirements for, in particular for UK and European biotech? Hamish, I think you're on mute. Yep.
There has to be one of those each presentation, doesn't it? Yes, there are local testing requirements, and it's the CDE and one of its subsidiary departments which will test according to China regulatory standards. And actually, Shun listed out some of those for certain products. There's so-called GB standards as well as YY standards, and these are you know, kind of recommended as well as mandatory standards and national or local standards. There's a sort of whole confluence of them and a large list that are substantially equivalent to European or UK standards, but sometimes with small differences. And so you need to evaluate for each product what, you know, it goes without saying, of course, each product needs to be evaluated for what testing is required, and the sample shipment that occurs can add to time and delay, and China is quite unique in its sometimes local testing requirements there as well. So yeah, I guess in summary, there are local testing requirements, and it always depends on the product. But this shouldn't scare UK companies from applying for China approvals, because it is basically the testing is a verification process to ensure that the product and the drug, you know, does what it says it will. That's what the process, the testing is about. And it does add to timeline and it does add to cost, but I don't think that itself should scare companies from applying for China registration.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm sure if the questioner would like to follow up with Hamish, I'm sure Hamish would be happy
Yeah,
to
please,
talk to you.
to talk further about that.
Perfect. So next question, Catherine, I thought we would follow up, and again, apologies for the audio difficulties, but I think, you know, one question that we have is sort of, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could kind of expand a little bit. You know, most of our audience, I think now is pretty familiar with GDPR compliance, even though maybe when it started, when it first came out, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions about what needed to be done. So, you know, given all that's happening now with changes in China regulations, you know, if for our audience today that is already in compliance with GDPR, how much more work do you think folks need to do to ensure that now, in addition to GDPR, that they're going to be in compliance with what they need to do with China privacy laws? You might be on mute.
Yeah, so I think, well, can everyone hear me? Because I honestly cannot hear any questions or interruptions, because I don't know what happened to the internet connectivity today. But
we can hear you now.
To answer
yeah.
Josh, okay, good. Because I can turn off my video if that works better. To answer your question, actually, I think the key distinction is under GDPR, a company can rely on legitimate interest to process personal information, even if it's not going through the consenting process. So that's actually the starting point of all the following requirements or statutory expectations. So under China's Personal Information Protection Law, the PIPL, you pretty much have to rely on the patient's informed consent. And the consent is divided into general consent and separate consent. And in most cases, we have seen in clinical trial compliance, we're trying to work with companies to actually modify their informed consent form that probably have been reviewed and finalized under GDPR to expressly show that we have been aware of the separate consent requirement. And we have to basically group the recipients and group the data type and group the processing purpose and methods of processing in order to show that we have addressed the separate consent requirement when there are sensitive personal data involved, or there are foreign recipients, foreign offshore personal information processors. And I don't think those are, I would say, expected in the same way under GDPR. I would say to some degree, China's Personal Information Protection Law didn't really give enough attention to the nature of clinical trial, and GCP compliance in most jurisdictions typically prevail the general data privacy requirements, but it's not clear under Chinese PIPL if you can completely refer to GCP compliance to replace your obligations under PIPL.
Thank you for that. And that, I think, is something that is obviously still evolving as these new rules are implemented. So I'm sure if folks have additional questions related to this, Catherine would be happy to talk to you offline. Shun, I wanted to ask you one question as well. You know, I thought a very interesting presentation. And, you know, we've been talking about regulatory and policy changes that have been impacting potential strategies for UK biotechs. But there's also obviously, you know, the pandemic that has happened, and you know, that has obviously impacted everyone and every business. And I would imagine it's also impacted, you know, cross-border logistics and importing of supplies and reagents into China, in particular for those in our UK and European audience today. Can you just talk about maybe not, you know, maybe it involves regulatory and policy changes, or maybe it just involves having to do things differently in order to successfully get the reagents that you need to do your work in China?
Yeah, after the COVID outbreak, the the lots of actually changes came into place. Is that first of all, I think the customers are very nervous about importing biological goods into China, so they have added this inspection process. I mean, previously they already have those sorts of a spot check, but during the outbreak, I think they checked everything. Literally, you know, anything is biological goods related, they would open it and check it, quarantine it. So that add a considerable amount of time to logistics. Also, then the has asked much more paperwork, different documents to be submitted to the customs, to the local authorities, and they come to the lab for the inspection, all that. So we did see quite a lot of policy change. And I think another thing I want to mention is really plan for the contingency sort of events. So obviously our lab is in Wuhan. It was at the center of the outbreak when it started. And there was the Chinese New Year period of time. So our employees actually went back home for the Chinese New Year and they couldn't return. They actually couldn't return back to the lab. The whole city was sealed off. And it was locked for, I can't remember now, 2 or 3 months. This was for that period of time. So luckily, we all have lots of things was stored on cloud. Lots of things you can access remotely. However, I just give an example for the tax declaration. You actually need to have one security pad. So like that security pad actually left in the office. So we couldn't access that, and it was no way. So we had to go through all this procedure to tell the tax authority we couldn't submit the tax form or that. So just to give you an example that when things suddenly happen, as you can see in China, they just close the whole city very quickly, and your employee probably wouldn't return. You know, your product can't get in, so you do have some contingency plan now on to think how to deal with those sorts of situations.
Thank you for that. So it sounds like you've had, as all of us have had to make quite a few adjustments to your business over the last 2 years, and I'm sure we'll all be watching what happens going into 2022, both with adjustments for what we might need to do for the pandemic, as well as some of these regulatory and policy updates that we've discussed today. I'm afraid we are just about out of time. I did want to thank all 3 of our speakers. I thought it was a really enlightening discussion. And on behalf of BIA, the China-Britain Business Council, and BioCentury, I also wanted to thank all of our audience today for your time. A quick reminder, if you are interested in learning more, please remember that BIA is a supporting organization for the 8th BioCentury Bay Helix China Healthcare Summit, November 16 to 19. You can visit biocentrychinaSummit.com for more information. There's also a discount for BIA members. So I wanted to thank everyone again for a great discussion. And until our next webinar, please have a great day or great evening, depending on where you're located, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you.